Despite having a comparable budget to a lot of other good-looking films of the time, the suit in 2011's Green Lantern is largely considered to be one of the worst-looking pieces of CGI of all time. One so bad that even the film's star, Ryan Reynolds, takes the opportunity to criticize the head floating around on a CGI body at basically every chance he gets.
Please don't make the super suit green or animated.
But is this fair? Wobbly heads and a CGI body were an issue all the way up until Avengers Endgame's time travel suits. And looking back on Green Lantern now, it's nowhere near as bad as some of these other examples we've seen in recent years, and Green Lantern had to do this a lot more in its film than these did in theirs. And so that's why in this video, I'm going to be the only person in perhaps all of history to actually defend the CGI of Green Lantern, by breaking down this suit to explore why this effect is so hard, and therefore why it's actually quite the impressive achievement that they got it looking even this good. And then we are also going to play a little bit of devil's advocate and look at how this single choice to use a CGI suit is probably what derailed a lot of things in this film's production and pretty much caused us to end up with the kind of strange film that we got. So to see why this suit was both a really brilliant but also really bad idea, set your samples to 1, that's a little CGI joke there,
Terrible.
and then suit up as we dive into the visual effects of Green Lantern. So why was Green Lantern's suit CGI in the first place? Were the filmmakers just being lazy, or did it come down to something else? Well, initially, the film's costume designer, Nagila Dixon, actually wanted to head down the practical direction and build something similar to what Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man had. But as the film progressed further and further through pre-production, what she found was that the need for CGI was becoming more and more crucial to being able to actually achieve the vision that the filmmakers had. Because the idea the filmmakers had was for the suit to basically be made out of the same energy that the Lantern's ring creates. And so essentially what they wanted was to mirror that same way that the suit was being portrayed in comic books and cartoons for years, and have it act as if it was this physical manifestation of the wearer's will itself. Which, to be honest, is actually a really cool idea, because it allowed them to do a lot of really fun, subtle things that you don't notice on your first, and admittedly probably only, watch through, like having the energy flow around depending on what the Lantern is doing, or by doing stuff like having that energy get brighter and stronger as Ryan Reynolds' character, Hal Jordan, gets more and more control over his powers as the film goes on. But as lovely as all of this sounds, what this also meant was that, to do this, unlike with Spider-Man, this costume couldn't just be some spandex outfit that the Lantern would just take on and off, but instead, it had to be this energy-based overlay which could adapt to the wearer's body and clothing as this almost manifested layer of armor. And so for Dixon, the only way she could see to make any of this possible was by using CGI. And so, sadly, this is also where things started to go wrong pretty quickly. Because what the end result of this was going to be was Ryan Reynolds' real head having to be blended on top of this CGI body for the vast majority of this film, which, like we said, is something that is so difficult that even modern movies still really struggle with getting this working. And so if this is such a big challenge, why did the filmmakers think this would work for an entire film all the way back in 2011? Well, 1 year prior to the release of Green Lantern, 2010's Alice in Wonderland was released, and this was a film that had a lot of its very own CGI issues, but what it did manage to do was have a very successful composite of a real head on top of a CGI body throughout the vast majority of its runtime when it came to the character of Stain. And so this essentially acted as a proof of concept for Green Lantern, showing that it was possible to do and emboldening them to go ahead with their CGI body. But here's the thing, it turns out that there are actually two very important factors as to why this technique worked really well for Stain, but at the same time caused Green Lantern's suit to be absurdly difficult. And the first of those two factors all come down to the genius design of Stain's body, because he was purposefully crafted to be wearing this big, clunky suit of armor, which did wonders for his visual effects, as it could cover up all of the complex detail of his squishy organic body, whereas Ryan Reynolds was basically wearing a skin-tight suit which, at the end of the day, occluded absolutely nothing from the audience. And so, whilst Stain's rigid body was relatively simple to get animated and looking right, when it came to Ryan Reynolds' body, in order to create a believable performance that didn't look like rubbery early 2000s CGI, the visual effects artist would have to go in and recreate every single little movement and detail that you would expect to see on a skin-tight suit, like muscles bulging or skin sliding around, each and every time Ryan Reynolds did anything. And when I say anything, I mean even down to the tiny little things like how his stomach should contract every time he talked, or even even breathed. And so this is already just an absurd amount of work to do for an entire film, and you can immediately begin to see how this can go wrong. However, the difficulty of creating this detail was then made 10 times harder by the fact that the motion capture suit that Ryan Reynolds was wearing on set to capture his performance wasn't actually tight enough for the visual effects artist to be able to visually see all of those different muscular responses in his body as he moved, which I mean is a shame for a lot of reasons, but most importantly meant that the visual effects artist now had no idea what sort of muscular animation they should actually be rebuilding on this CGI body, because they just literally couldn't see it. Meaning that to figure out what they needed, they had no choice but to film their own bodies and their own muscles doing all of these movements, and then attempt to transfer those details across to Ryan Reynolds' CGI body retroactively, which of course just isn't great for maintaining realism at all, because now all of the sources you're referencing are just completely different to the thing you're actually trying to create. And so when you put the CGI body that has so much working against it, but at the same time had to deliver so many tiny little fake details right next to a real human head with all of its genuine real world complexity, then of course it's really hard to stop the audience's brain from noticing that something is not right with the CGI half of the character. But you know what? Despite how ridiculously hard this wasn't even remotely the single biggest issue they ran into when doing this CGI head-body match. Because think about it, we see characters with fully CGI bodies a lot these days, and whilst the odds are definitely stacked against them looking good, it's not something that's entirely impossible to get right. And so in this regard, there's no technical reason why just a CGI body should have been such a massive nightmare for Green Lantern. And so this brings us to the second and much more important factor as to why Stain works so well whilst Green Lantern struggles so hard. But first, speaking of how brilliantly complicated this film's visual effects were, this brings me to the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant. Because for the last few months, I've actually been managing to successfully learn skills on a daily basis from the comfort of my own home, all by using Brilliant and its thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, AI, and most interestingly to me, programming. Because Brilliant has this unique learn by doing approach where its quick daily lessons have a hands-on and from the ground up problem-solving methodology that actually lets you build your critical thinking skills and understand how what you're actually studying works, rather than just being something that you fail to memorize from some boring YouTube lecture. And so by following along with Brilliant's programming with Python courses, I've actually been able to start thinking like a programmer and even start building my own programs with their built-in drag and drop editor, in addition to being able to genuinely understand some of the essential coding elements like creating loops and using variables, to the point where I'm actually slowly starting to be able to write some of my own programs for use in my daily life. So if you're looking to learn anything from Python coding to data analysis to cutting edge AI tools, all in a bite-sized way that means you can actually stay consistent with learning, then I highly recommend checking out everything Brilliant has to offer for 30 days for free by clicking on my link in the description and going to brilliant.org/CGY, where you can also get a whopping 20% off an annual premium subscription. So click the link below to finally start working towards those goals you've been putting off for literally years with Brilliant. And with that, thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and now back to the video, and back to the second factor which differentiated Stain from Green Lantern. And this was the process of getting that real human head to actually sit on top of the CGI body, or much more importantly, getting that neckline transition point between the CGI and the real human skin to look 100% correct. So what went wrong and what made this such a major challenge for the visual effects artists? Well, in short, the human neck is just full of all of these tiny little details and movements, and these movements are even more important to get right than those across the rest of his body, as almost every single thing you do with your head has some kind of subtle knock-on effect that ripples throughout all of the tiny little muscles and skin in the neck. And so having this area that's so dense with detail be the meeting point between your CGI suit and your real skin presents an absurdly big problem, as you have to constantly make sure your CGI matches up to and keeps matching up to the ever-changing tiny subtleties of this neck. And so again, if we go and take a look at Stain, we can see that they actually gave him this massive collar around his neck, and this just immediately eliminates this problem for you, as now all of this tiny neck detail is very subtly and very brilliantly completely occluded from the audience's view, whereas Green Lantern didn't have this luxury. And so for an entire film, the visual effects artists had to do something that other films can't even handle for just a few shots. And so you can only imagine how much work it was to get it looking even this good, but also also just how much time and resources this meticulous matching process dragged away from other parts of the project, the consequences of which we'll loop back to and properly discuss in just a minute. But first, to give just a little bit more context to how ridiculously difficult this was, there was just one more final thing I wanted to quickly cover that will really help to tie together just exactly why all of this went so wrong. And this was that, before they even got to doing any of these tiny little muscular movements, the visual effects artist first had to animate Ryan Reynolds' suit correctly for the entire film. Because despite the fact that motion capture was used to record the vast majority of Ryan Reynolds' movement, the sad reality of motion capture is that in pretty much every single scenario, motion capture data is never actually accurate enough, and animators still have to go in to clean up and rebuild a lot of this data from scratch. And so this meant that the artist had to spend hours and hours manually realigning this CGI body to Ryan Reynolds' live action performance, which apparently was such a nightmare to do and became such a time-consuming process to get right that the visual effects artists actually started to, where they could, replace the real-life Ryan Reynolds with just a fully CGI clone, because completely replacing him became significantly easier than having to do this meticulous full-body matching process, which is something that I've never actually heard of a film doing, because despite how much bad press CGI gets, visual effects artists do often try their best to maintain an actor's performance, and so for them to say screw this and just chuck out Ryan Reynolds' acting shows just how bad things must have been behind the scenes. And so to wrap all of this up, am I saying that this suit was the most photorealistic bit of CGI ever? No, of course not. It definitely has its issues. But what I am saying is that when you factor in everything this film's CGI was working against, I think this suit is actually a very impressive piece of work. Because, I mean, if you just look at this film's budget, you can clearly see just how many hours the artist must have had to have poured into this in order to get it to remotely work. As if you compare the smaller scales and scope of this film to something gargantuan like Transformers 3 that has giant robots fighting for like the entire second hour of that film, then you can begin to see that probably most of Green Lantern's budget must have gone into crafting those hundreds of shots of the suit doing hundreds of different things. And so the fact that it was this difficult and yet they still managed to maintain a quite consistent level of visual quality throughout the vast majority of this film is something that I think it's never once gotten a single ounce of praise for. But now, does all of this mean that it was a good idea to make this suit fully CGI? Well, probably not. Probably giving him a somewhat at least practical suit like Tom Holland's Spider-Man often wears before it gets replaced with CGI would probably have been a very good idea, just to give the artist something real to work with and to fall back on if they needed to. However, if we do take the premise that they needed CGI to make their ideas for this film work, then did any benefits come from them doing so, aside from the few we mentioned earlier? Well, one positive are those weapons that Ryan Reynolds creates with his mind, also known as constructs, because whilst they may have lacked in creativity, visually they looked brilliant, and from a production point of view, these effects posed that classic challenge of taking something that works well on the pages of a comic book, you know, manifesting green transparent weapons out of thin air, and then turning that into something that still actually works well on film. And I think the way that the visual effects artist handled this was brilliant, because firstly, they decided that these constructs should actually manifest themselves as these kind of reverse explosions, where all of them would build themselves up around this central point and give it that feeling of your mind pulling together a mental picture as the object manifests itself. Then, to create that transparent look that the constructs have, the artist then went in and built each internal layer of these constructs, making sure to factor in all of their different inner workings so that then when they blended them all together, you really got this formed from energy feeling because you could see how each and every one was put together. And so when you combine this with the fact that they purposefully crafted the suit to be made out of this same energy, you really do get the feeling that there's this coherent set of rules binding all of the technology of the Lantern core together. And doing this adds a lot of subtlety to the visuals of a Lantern's power set that would otherwise be really easy to overlook. And so, furthermore, along similar lines to this, another thing this film did really well was take the opportunity to inject a lot of background personality into the different CGI characters we see in this film. For example, a lot of effort went into fleshing out how each member of the Lantern Corps worked, giving each one their own unique suit design, construct manifestation style, and even their own unique movement patterns, with Tomar Ree, the fish bird guy, having a much more fluid fishy bird flight style, and fighter pilot Hal Jordan having a much more rigid and tight jet fighter inspired flight style. And so a lot of this creative freedom came from the filmmaking freedom of using a lot of CGI, as now everything about every race on screen could be easily tailored to make it so that these background characters aren't just some generic alien crowd that's gathered there, but instead they could truly be that vision of the Lantern Corps being formed from thousands of different unique individual galactic species, and therefore make this world that Ryan Reynolds is thrown into seem so much bigger, as now, much like him, we as the audience just get a slight glimpse into all of these many different cultures. And so if you ever do sit down to watch this film again, I do really encourage looking at things like the appearances of the Lantern Corps in particular, because there's a lot of really interesting creative artistic choices running throughout the background of this film, and it is actually a shame that they're overshadowed by the rest of the discussion around the CGI suit. And so to conclude, I think it's safe to say that Green Lantern is a film with a lot of very promising ideas, but that it just took some of those ideas a little bit too far and got bogged down in the ever so enticing quicksand of solving every problem with CGI. But what do you guys think? Has this film actually ended up aging quite well, like a lot of other films from the past have seemed to, or is it still terrible? And what other films do you think had a lot of promise but then just seemed to mess them up in the execution? Oh, and finally, I just want to give a massive thank you to all of my Patreon subs. So thank you to Matt Locke, Cthulhu88, Chris Coling, Archer Green, Modern Adventurer, and an even bigger thank you to Lime, Rye Jones, Ishita Thakar on YouTube, Darth Gator, and then I just have to give an absolutely massive, ginormous thank you to Darren Birmingham for donating in the top tier of the Patreon. I literally cannot begin to explain how grateful I am. So thank you so much, and all of the money from the Patreon gets poured straight back into the videos. So I really hope to keep making videos that are worthy of your support. So thank you again.